This video covers Chapter 4, Land Use Control and Regulations. It has 5 questions on your state licensing exam. All right, land use controls. We're going to go over some zoning issues. We're going to go over water rights. If you own a place at a lake, this might affect you, or a navigable river. We'll discuss that. We talk about, some of this is we discussed in Chapter 3. It's kind of Chapter 3 and 4 deal with the same basic criteria and material. So let's go straight into it. Under the outline of concepts, Roman numeral 1A, police power. This is kind of redundant. Police power, the power of the state to promulgate rules aimed at promoting the general welfare and protecting public health and safety. I read that to you because it's a very good example of exactly what police powers are. Again, like in Chapter 3, we've discussed that already. B, taxation. We know what that is. C, eminent domain. These are all good descriptions of what we discussed in Chapter 3. It's cheat if you if you pass away and leave no heirs. Remember that one. And now we'll stop and concentrate on water rights. There's 2 types of water rights, and this is one of those kind of quirky things I remembered whenever I had to take my licensing class way back in 1986-87. When you live by a waterway, now this can be navigable or non-navigable. There's 2 types of ownership. The first one being littoral. Now littoral is to the high water mark. So that watermark can go back and forth. So the way I remember it is I say if you go up to the water and you look down and it's literally the water's edge, that helps me remember littoral. So it's the water's edge. The other thing is you have to know about littoral is this is the way I remembered it, I see a boat going by or a ship going by. That's a navigable waterway. So literally what I see in front of me, and a ship going by. That's navigable, which indicates there's some commerce going on. If you got that one, then you're going to know what riparian is automatically. So if you learn that one, then you're going to know what this one is. Riparian is that you own to the center mark of whatever the waterway is. So riparian's to the center, littoral's to the edge. Navigable, non-navigable. Simple as that, real easy. Go to the next page. Roman numeral 2, control of land use. A, public land use controls. Under police powers, each state has the authority to adjust regulations required for protecting public health, safety, and general welfare. That is zoning, the first thing that we'll discuss. Let me show you a diagram. You'll notice if you just drive through any intersection of a major metropolitan area, you'll have different buildings, different sizes, different commerce that's going on around it. And what you may not realize is that most of these municipalities, they have a grand design for how the growth of the city should look like. Well, here's what ideally a particular zoning structure should look like. Let's just assume this is the corner of a very busy intersection. You know, something like 45,000 cars go up and down. We all know what a busy intersection looks like. The best way to do this is you go from high density to low density. So the zoning regulations when towns develop cities is they want this to be commercial. Lots of traffic going in and out. Let's just say, let's use, like a quick convenience store of some kind will be on the corner. Beyond that, you'll have what they call office light, or it'll be less dense. Office light is usually just a 1 or 2 story doctor's office, law offices. Those are the kind of things that occupy office light. Then you go to a multifamily, an apartment complex. Then they'll have behind the multifamily a residential area. That gives those what they call buffer zones. So you don't have a commercial property sitting right next to a residential house. I know that those things exist, but those things were maybe built 100 years ago, and then that's the way it all kind of just came about. But now you'll notice that a lot of municipalities will start designing square miles in this way. Okay? Go to 1A we're still at page 40, non-conforming use. Use in existence prior to the passage of a zoning ordinance. So maybe there was a gas station that was built in 1920, but everywhere around this gas station, all these people started knocking old houses down and building all new ones. That would be a variance, something different than what should be there. Okay, those are variances. I moved ahead. Those are non-conforming uses. The next one, B, is a variance, which says that I want to build this property, and I know it's next to one of these things, but it's not in this perfect little scenario. Can you issue me a variance and I can build this property, whatever it may be? So that's a variance. Go down to buffer zone. E is pretty much what I just explained. That right there is considered the buffer zone. You get high density to low density properties. H, density zoning ordinance that restrict the average maximum number of houses per acre that may be built within a particular area. When you start getting into these residential areas, there's a lot of things that the engineers look for. And some of the things they look for are how the water runs off. So let's say in a high density area you have a lot of runoff and it's maybe on a hill. Those are the kind of things engineers have to look at whenever you're developing subdivisions, because there's a lot of things that can happen if you don't provide enough space. Some of these areas, if you drive by an area that has this big sunken area and then they put 2 goalposts or soccer goals, that probably wasn't intended for a soccer area. It's a water runoff area that the public uses as a recreational area. So those are the things you have to look at whenever you're zoning and you're developing these subdivisions. Number 2 on page 40, building codes. Probably know what those are. When you build a property, and I've had some construction experience, I used to be a general contractor. When you build a property, you give your plans to the city engineer. City engineer goes throughout everything in your plans. You have to have, a lot plan. You have to have a footing plan. So you have to have all these multiple things that you give the city so they can look at and determine the size and the square footage, minimum square footages. And what they also look at is as you build your property, there are these different phases. So as you have these different phases that you're building, a city inspector goes out and makes sure that the heating and air conditioning system is working, or rather developed properly. The square footage is within acceptable ranges in the area. They look at the footing and foundation, they do the framing, and they make sure that it's up to building standards and building codes. And every builder that builds has to have their municipality go out and inspect that property to make sure it's to that standard. Number 5, EPA, environmental protection laws. I'm going to go through for the next 2 or 3 pages. I want you to know the difference between knowing something and learning it, or just being familiar with it and actually learning it. So you might get a few questions that deal with this, and as long as you know what they are or have a basic understanding of what the concept is, you'll do fine on the test. So these next couple of pages are, I will tell you if you really need to know it. Most of this is just kind of learn it, be familiar with it. So when you see it on a test, you'll say, oh, I kind of know what that is. Go to D, top of page 41. Taxation on real estate. 1, real estate taxes generally take priority over all of the liens. We've discussed that in the previous chapter. 2, ad valorem tax. There's a chance that you will have an ad valorem tax question on your exam. What this means is, and I'll read it, Latin for according to value includes taxes levied on real property, real estate by various governmental units and municipalities. That is the tax that you pay. When you own a property, you get a statement every year that says, here are the taxes that you paid. In most cases, the lender actually pulls that out of your payment, or whenever you send your lender a payment, that's part of your payment every month is the taxes. And those taxes are paid, and they're your property taxes, which are called ad valorem taxes. So just be familiar with that term. Go to 5C. Know this. This is one of the calculations you'll have to know for your exam. It's called a millage rate, and that's how they assess your value of your property. C, the tax rate may be expressed in mils. For example, 40 mils is a percent, equals 4% of the taxable value. 45 mils, there you go, 4.5% of taxable value. So they might give you, and here's what I want you to do. On your own time, go to D and go through that calculation and be familiar with that calculation. Okay, next section, Roman numeral 3. Be familiar with this next several points as we go through the next couple pages. First is A, floodplain. Portions of land located near running bodies of water, such as rivers or lakes, are subject to flooding. Government controls generally restrict building in a floodplain. There are two different types of floodplains. There's technically three, but I don't want to confuse you. Everybody that lives in a municipality, at least around here anyway, lives in a flood zone. Okay? It might be the highest mountaintop, you're in C, so it goes A, B, or C. So you could be on a mountain, you're still going to be in C because, Noah and the flood, the 40 days and nights of flooding, I suppose could occur. So that's why no one ever, they can't ever say mathematically you'll never ever flood. But what they've done is they simplified it for us, and they have non-shaded and shaded areas. And the shaded and non-shaded and shaded areas make the distinction between which, if you need flood insurance and don't need flood insurance. All right. And so whenever you list property, you'll know that the seller will say, "Yes, I pay flood insurance." That'll go in your disclosures that to the new homeowner, yes, they pay flood insurance, and it's in a flood zone or quote flood zone. Next page, top of page 40, D. Who regulates this information? And that's the Federal Emergency Management Association. We all know it as FEMA. Requires the purchase of flood insurance for homes built within their designated flood zone. So the governing body over flood zones is called FEMA. Number 4, Roman numeral 4, health and safety codes. There's A, we discussed building codes. 1, specify construction standards that must be met when erecting, maintaining, or demolishing buildings. Go to 3, enforced by issuing building permits. So there it is. Roman numeral number 5, environmental concerns. B, role of real estate licensees regarding environmental risk in real estate transactions. These next 3 or 4 different sections that we discuss on page 42 and 43, that pretty much sums it up. You don't have to be an EPA expert when you're listing property. You have to be aware of the potential problems that could occur if you don't understand these or are not aware of your surroundings, what things it can affect property, what things it can affect property values. So you just need to be aware of all these. First one, and that says it all. B1, be alert to the possibility of pollution and hazardous substances on the property being sold. If you're getting into the commercial industry, a lot of this that we discuss in these classes is primarily residential. But if you do get into industrial and commercial, that end of it, you'll deal with a lot of these things more than maybe your residential expert. Go to page 43, 2, under C, asbestos. Many of you have probably heard about asbestos. It's a material used for many years as an insulation, plumbing pipes, heating ducts, A lot of that's all gone away, but you still might run into it in some of the older homes. There's an abatement process that you have to go through to get rid of all that. They get in big suits and masks and everything else, and they can get rid of it. But be aware of that. Number 3, urea formaldehyde. It's UFFI, a synthetic material generally used to insulate buildings prior to 1978. That's also something that you can get inspection for. So you're thinking, okay, well, how does this all kind of work whenever you sell property? There are inspectors that will turnkey most of these items. So you hire an inspector. The inspector goes in and gives you a long list of things that say, okay, what would you like for us to inspect? Well, I want that and that, that and that. So all these things are part of that process that you get inspected. 4 is one that is the most relevant that we deal with, because you might want to make a note outside number 4 that says seller's requirement or seller disclosure or even licensee disclosure. This is one of the things that when we sell property, we have to get a document that states from the seller, and it's pretty simple, honestly. I have it, I don't have it, or I have it and this is what I've done about it. Many sellers don't have any idea, that's fine, but they have to, as part of your licensee, you have to make sure that that document is signed. Many of the documents that you're going to encounter in the business will be provided by your broker. So when you go on board a company and you're listing a property, they will have most of these documents all lined out for you, and you take them to the seller, and it's, all this will be provided to you. Next page, 44, top of 44. Sources of lead poisoning. Under B, peeling or flaking paint. And 2, water supply systems. The one you need to remember is the date. C1, owners of residential properties built before 1978. They have to have the document signed that I referred to a minute ago. So you have to have that document signed, given to the prospective purchasers, that document of any house that was built prior to 1978. The other thing they get is 2, a lead-based paint disclosure statement attached to and separate as a separate item. And then the other thing that they get, that's the actual document. Number 3 is practitioners must distribute to buyers renters a federal lead hazard pamphlet. Essentially, it's a package of information that says, here's what lead does, here's the serious consequences of lead, and then here's what you can do about it. So it's the document you have to give and the pamphlet. Those are the 2 requirements of licensees. So that goes under a couple different categories. You'll see some of these things apply to one chapter that apply to another chapter. So that's one of your seller's mandated disclosures. Go all the way over to, well, let me just touch upon 5, PCBs. You got to be aware of that. Number 6, disposal sites, waste disposal sites, those might be in the area. Number 7, underground storage tanks. 8, groundwater contamination. 9, electromagnetic fields, power line areas. There's even a test that you can test to see if there's any dangers, the levels are within acceptable range. The last one there is 10, mold. Be aware of that. You see inspectors again, if there's any visible evidence of mold, then they can inspect for that too. Okay, go to 46D. Who administers this information and who's kind of in charge of this? And that's 1, Environmental Protection Agency. So the EPA is the one that sets out the standards for all these different materials. Go to E2. No CERCLA. The Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act was created in 1980, and here's what it did. A, it established this fund called the Superfund. B, it created a process for identifying liable parties and ordering them to take responsibility for those cleanups. So develop the Superfund, and then it was an agency to go out and say, okay, who's responsible for this cleanup? So it's really just a response or compensation program set up to clean up some of these toxic waste places. Go to F on page 47. Agents' responsibilities. I'm going to read through this whole thing because you're going to need to know all this. Most state laws do not hold listing agents or buyer's agents to a standard of discovery. I'm going to stop there. They don't require you to go out and try to figure out if it has mold and asbestos and all that. But if a seller says something like, well, I think I might have mold, then that's something you need to act on. Okay, well, we need to get an expert in here to determine that. Seller doesn't really know, you don't really know, so you need to have someone come in and take a look at it. This is why most states have passed a Seller's Property Disclosure Act. This again is a mandated disclosure. In the state of Oklahoma, there's a document that says, it enumerates every single thing about the property, and as you go through, the seller is supposed to fill that out. You're not supposed to be filling that out for the seller. The seller will fill those documents out, and as they go through it, it says yes, no, it's working, it's not working. Everything they've ever known about that property that's in ill repair, bad repair, or any problems with it at all. Even if they've done repairs 5 years ago, it's best to be put in there and say, yes, I had a plumbing leak, it's been repaired, and it's okay. So that's a seller's disclosure, and that's one of the mandated disclosures. With the new legislation, the burden to disclose both known and latent property defects to the buyer is shifted to the seller. However, if the listing agents know or have been made aware of the material defect, they must obviously disclose what they know. A buyer's agent is held to the same standard: discovery, no; disclosure, yes. It's very simply put. You don't have to go out and determine these things, but know these things and be aware of these things to the point where you can contact the proper authorities or the proper experts to determine these things. Next, deed restrictions or covenants. A, private restrictions written into deeds or leases that limit the use of property. Earlier I talked about what you can put into a building or your construction. You have to have a certain amount of bricks, certain amount of siding, and all has to kind of look like this. And even some of these subdivisions have architectural design committees to allow you to do certain things. Go to D. Adjoining lot owners in a subdivision can lose their right to the court's injunction by inaction under the doctrine of laches, the loss of a right through undue delay or failure to assert the right. I'm not an attorney, and that's why I don't get into legal matters. But from what I understand is, if maybe you had a material on your property over a certain number of years, it's been that way for a really, really long time, and then the subdivision says, hey, you can't have that. I think, from what I understand, it's hard for them to say after 25 years, hey, take that off and redo it. Okay, so that's what they're talking about there. Water rights, number 7, C1, accretion. Anytime you have an area you're living around somewhere where the water goes up and down, maybe in a bottomland, accretion means land caused or accretion, increasing. Erosion, you know what that is? Part of your property can erode away. And avulsion is sudden loss. I always picture these California homes on the up there in the Malibu, and avulsion is when the side of the cliff comes off and their house goes, tumbling down. That's an avulsion. That's a sudden loss of land. All right, that concludes chapter 4.